Okay, hey everybody, it's John Gallagher here from the Comic Book Diner, and we have a very special guest here tonight. I have with me Harald Buchholz, who works right now with Archie Comics. He's senior vice president of publishing and all things awesome.
Operations, that's right.
Operations, okay. And then Jimmy Gownley, who is not.
No, I'm not. I'm not the senior vice president of anything anymore. Thank you.
Exactly. Jimmy Gownley, who is well known for his book series, Amelia Rules. Before that, Shades of Grey, and now has a very special new book coming out entitled The Dumbest Idea Ever. And we're going to be talking about that tonight, as well as all the great things going on at Archie. And then, as some people may know, Jimmy, you and Harald co-created Kids Love Comics, which I was lucky enough to be there at the beginning of, an organization.
At the end of, I think.
And at the end of, exactly. And to basically to promote, just promote graphic novels and comics as something that kids can enjoy and learn from.
Well, yeah. It's funny now looking back, but I've been on a couple panels recently, both at New York Comic Con and in San Diego as well, about kids' comics. And now it's just assumed, oh, yes, comics for kids are thriving and it's wonderful. And, of course, who wouldn't, support comics for kids? Like, one of the questions I got asked on one of these panels was like, well, did you ever consider, like, maybe going with one of these well-known licensed properties to start your career, like My Little Pony or what? Like, you're delusional. None of that stuff was around. People forget how actively hostile, not passive, not, apathetic, actively hostile the comic book industry was to kids' comics just a decade ago. So I think it was in 2003 or 2004, I put together a thing in one of the Amelia issues, and I said, if you send me $200, I'll send you a painting and a subscription for the next 6 issues of Amelia, and I'll use it to promote kids' comics. I just don't know how. And still people did that. It was a simpler time, the aughts, and people actually did that. And I think the first person I called was Harald, and I said, do you want to go, to an island somewhere? He's like, no, you have to be honest about it. I'm like, oh. So that was disappointing. But we came up with the idea of Kids Love Comics at the time, and it was Harald's title. Correct?
Yeah, because we were trying to figure out, if we're going to name this thing, how do we get it across and get instantly what it's about? And that seemed to be what we were trying to say. And, a lot of it was saying it to adults, not to kids, because we still had to get to the kids through the adults. So, yeah, let's call it Kids Love Comics, because you had to tell people that kids love comics, because at the time the industry was wondering, are we not going to get any future generations? Are they all on video games and other things? They've moved on. And we kind of knew that wasn't the case, that if you got a comic in a kid's hand, they're gonna like it. As a rule, they're going to really enjoy it. And at the time, that was genuinely something that the industry was grappling with, whether or not comics were actually still appealing to children.
Well, and there's still parts of the industry today, in terms of this traditional superhero comic book industry, when you think of the comic book industry. I don't know if you guys have heard the thing that's been going around about Paul Pope and the Commandy book he wanted to do with DC.
Oh, yeah. What was it? He had just done a Batman book, and I believe he went to the editor-in-chief and said, I want to do a Commandy book for kids. Is that right?
Yeah, well, and for people who don't know, I assume most people know, but Paul Pope is, a really respected creator, a really talented guy, and he did Batman year 1000 for DC, and it was a big success. So I wanted to do this Commandy, and apparently they said, hey, if you think this is going to be for kids, forget it. If you want to do kids comics, you can do Scooby-Doo. So there's that industry. That still exists. But in the meantime, the same artist, Paul Pope, is doing a book for First Second, Battling Boy, which is going out and doing great and selling to thousands and thousands of kids, just not as a floppy 32-page comic published by DC or Marvel.
Right. Right. And I think
they might still die on that hill. I don't know.
They even said something like, we do books for 40-year-olds. Which
45-year-olds.
Yeah,
not even. We're still
nice. Which means I am the peak demographic for DC Comics right now. I'm very excited about that.
How's that going?
What's going to be great is when we're in a nursing home, we'll be able to read about Batman in a nursing home, because that's their whole idea. It's always the same idea. It's like, comics should be for adults. What can we do? Can we make Batman older? Yes, make Batman older. And it's like, comics should be for kids. What can we do? Make the Teen Titans younger. Yes, that is it. Genius.
Pre-Teen Titans. It's great.
The pre-Teen Titans, exactly.
Which is not to disparage. That's a wonderful thing.
So it's funny because I had actually had a retailer say that to me, that he had gone to the DC Retailer Summit, which they do every year, and basically it had pretty much come out. He said, I think DC Comics, and of course, for those who might not know, DC Comics, someone who may be coming in from a completely different direction, because, of course, Archie is, for many people, their entry-level comic. Amelia Rules is now carried by Simon & Schuster. Is it Amulet?
No, Athenaeum.
Athenaeum. That's so great that I can say a different company like that. But
that's my entire publishing career is based on learning different things of language. Self-publishing, I wanted to learn how to spell Renaissance, so that's that. And then I wanted to learn how to pronounce Athenaeum. That's not Athenaeum, like I said in my first meeting.
Maybe you can do something for Disney's new supercalifragilistic superalidocious books. But he said that DC had pretty much made their decision, that they were developing for Hollywood, they were selling to collectors, and I think that's one of those things where they had this golden opportunity, and as other publishers have, and I personally see that as an opportunity for any company, the big publishers especially, that there's a whole void that's been left open and has sort of started to be filled in just in the last 10 years. And Amelia is a big part of that. Bone, some other books, Smile, Drama, and the work of Dave Roman is doing Astronaut Elementary. And then Archie has been in the press more probably in the last 5-6 years than it had in the last 30. And it's a pretty exciting time for Archie as well.
Yeah, it is interesting to see there are different models now for getting comics out. They used to be the newsstand and really inexpensive comics, and then we had the direct market take that over, and the prices kind of rose on that, but they were still selling 32-page comics. And with the advent of the graphic novel really taking off, particularly for kids, we're finding, it seems like every few months somebody's finding a new way to get comics into the hands of kids, and that's one of the great things that is, I think, really, really fun about the industry right now is it's not being done in just one way. Jim's new book is it's over 200 pages, and in hardcover and softcover on release. Yeah, it's an impressive tome there.
Yeah, you can hurt someone if you needed to.
Right. Now, see, I'm going to meet that with my 1,000-page digest. We're going to have a little. But this is an example of something where we actually are taking our digest material, the same things that are in the digest, and we're putting it out for the book form. And when I set this up for Archie, it was let's see if we can make a product that would really do well in club stores. Now, how many comics would you thought would have been sold in club stores even like 5
So when you
years?
say club, you mean the Walmart type club, Costco, Sam's Club?
Yeah, Costco, Sam's, BJ's, those types of places. Because basically I needed a $15 price point item. I thought that would be about what you'd need based on what I'd seen in the stores. But you also need really good value. And then they're going to discount it on top of that as a rule. And so that's where this came from. And it's got picked up by Costco in Canada and Walmart in Canada. And they kind of, and as well as Barnes & Noble here in the States. And they really kind of led the charge to put those books out in a different way. So you get 1,000 pages of color comics, and they're charging in Canada, I think, less than $10, both Walmart and Costco are, and people are snapping them up. But that didn't exist. That kind of way of getting comics into people's hands didn't exist, just even a few months ago.
Well, and I have to say this, and Harold gets mad at me, I think, when I say this, and I know his wife gets doubly mad at me, but Harold's a genius. Harold, and if anybody who is watching this likes Amelia and happy that I got to write the end at the last page of Amelia, it's in large part because of Harold. Because we didn't talk about this earlier, but Harold worked with me at Renaissance Press when we were still self-publishing Amelia. And, there was very little model of what you could do at all. And one of the things this amazing opportunity that came to us was Scholastic Book Fairs was interested in possibly carrying Amelia. And it was so much the Wild West at the time that this is how it happened. I went to their website. Well, actually, it was in 2002. I said to Harold, hey, we need to be in one of those papers that they give out in school. What are those things called? He's like, oh, those Scholastic Book Club? Yeah, we need to be in that. It's like, well, that'll never happen. Okay. So a few years later, Harold was working for me, so I went to their website, and it's like, here we are Scholastic. We don't want to hear from you. Never, ever call us. Certainly don't call us. Remember, please don't call us.
Here's our number.
And they had a phone number, so I thought, how serious can they be? So I called up, and I said, hi, my name's Jimmy Gownley. I publish a comic book called Amelia Rules. And they said, I'm sorry, we don't carry comic books. I said, I completely understand. Thank you for your time. And I hung up. I waited 3 weeks, and I called back. I said, hi, I'm Jimmy Gownley. I publish a graphic novel series called Amelia Rules. They said, oh, really? I said, yes. And through a variety of machinations, we ended up meeting with the guy who runs the book fairs, a guy named Ed Massessa. And going into the meeting, I said to Harold, I'm like, I have no idea what it's going to take. But whatever he asks us to do, we just say yes, and then we figure out how to do it.
Yes.
And so we went into a meeting, and and when I say we would have to figure out how to do it, it would be Harold would have to figure out how to do it. And it was very specific. It needed to be a certain trim size. It needed to be a certain price point. It needed to be a certain amount of pages. It needed to be full color. It needed to be for whatever that low price was. And Harold just said yes. And then somehow managed to make it happen. And I think it was the only, if it wasn't the only, it was one of only 1 or 2 times he ever went and did that with a self-published book to get it in.
You said there were only 2 publishers as small as Renaissance Press, which Renaissance Press was. was
a few of us.
Right.
It's such a small publisher that Scholastic would do it, and that's definitely a testimony to the work, because he said, and the reason for that wasn't because he didn't like small publishers. It was because usually small publishers, there were 2 or 3 or 4 things that they just didn't get yet, that you needed to know for the general book market. And he said, the Amelia books are, you've hit everything you need to in terms of the quality and the editing and the proofreading and the, he's kind of the design, the spine. I mean, everything. He said it's working, and so he felt confident to work with Jim and Renaissance because the books were good. But at the same time, we were just this little tiny company stepping into the realm of the book fairs and clubs, and their material on how to get stuff out. I guess if you've been doing it for years and you're doing maybe a dozen titles within a year, it kind of makes sense. But when you're doing it for the first time, it was I called it like peeling away the layers of an onion. As you learn, that actually has to do with this, and there's this document here, and it was quite an undertaking to get that, surprisingly complex, to get that book done. But yeah, we actually, I did go back to Ed, and we did change stuff. We said yes at the meeting.
Yeah, right.
I said, this manga size is maybe is popular too. Could we do manga? We changed it in paper stock and all that, and made it possible to make it happen. But it was amazing to be at the threshold of this thing that that we were talking about just a couple years earlier as this pipe dream, and all of a sudden it was right there, right in our lap.
I mean, it was essentially impossible to. Well, I was even just saying, and this is about this book. I was saying there were some technical difficulties before this started, so we had some time to chat, and I was saying nothing to do with the quality of my work, but just as a physical object that Scholastic put this book out. If I would have gotten this as a kid on like Christmas Day, it would have blown my mind. A 240-page full-color comic book about cartooning. I probably would have thought, I wish the guy could draw better, but, as just an object, it's an amazing thing. I would love to be a kid and have the variety of material, out there.
Because I do want to talk about your new book, and, it may... A lot of people may be coming to this podcast because of this specific book after the fact, because I think it's really, Harold and I both talked about it, and I was lucky enough to get to read the proofs in San Diego earlier this year, and it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm really excited because it's Jimmy's book. It's by my friend. I want it to be really good, but I had like 2 or 3 moments, and I'm like, that happened to me. This has happened to me. I got like chills thinking about this, but the thing was, I wasn't getting chills like as an adult who was relating to my life. No, I was like, because essentially I am an 11-year-old child inside a 45-year-old man's body. I was 11 again, and I was reading it, and I was like, yes, I remember that moment. I want to be in this moment and do this, but having said all that and teased all that, I want to go back to the Amelia Rules book for Scholastic. And so you had how many issues out at that point? Like
16.
16, okay. And then
I don't know. I'm trying to think. We would have had to because we had the first 3 trade paperbacks out.
Okay.
So
and had you when you put this together, how did you decide what to put in that book? Because you had so many pages. What was it that you decided to offer up?
They had to. That was tough too, because they all had to be self-contained enough, but it had to feel also like a satisfying read in and of itself. And I had just finished this story called Funny Story, which I felt like that was like the platonic ideal of an Amelia story as best as I could do at that time. And I knew that was going to be the last thing. And then I knew you had to do an introductory story. So, and then fill in just the funniest moments. I think, because the thing about Amelia too is that there are moments where it's not so funny. There's an Iraq War issue, and there's all kinds of other stuff. But this was going to be called Funny Stories, based on that last story. So we just tried to go through and pick the ones that we thought were the best, funniest stories, and hope it fit that 128-page format.
That's great.
Then there were like, huh?
Oh, did you? And you really brought it in at 128, or were you like at 140? And
no, I think we got it like right on the money.
That's great. I remember, Harold, you even had figured out the ratio of panels per page versus other books. This is something that Harold has always done. He can create like a bar graph in his head of the comic.
Anything.
Studies of 1932 versus sequential art in the 27th century, which hasn't happened yet, and figure out what on a bar graph where we're headed. So
about the bar graph,
a pie chart maybe. I like pie.
I can't do pie.
I like pie.
Yeah. So so the reaction was really, you definitely got the orders that you were hoping for with the Scholastic book.
Yeah. That was a good day, as I recall. Well, there's a really funny story of that too, because I had gone to a show. I want to say it was SPX, but it couldn't have been SPX. It was some other show. And I had gotten the check for it, and I was going to meet Harold there. I don't know if you remember this. But I had it in my back pocket, and it was like, it was real money.
Yeah.
I wasn't fooling around any more money. And I wanted to show Harold this. And a guy came up to me who is very well known, and at the time was a publisher of a comic book company that was not Marvel and DC, but that has a really, they have their own certain image in the field. And he came up to me and he's like, I don't know how you're doing this. What, are you spending like your inheritance you're getting from your parents? Like, and that, first off, it shows what you know about my parents. And secondly, it really showed, like, I thought the ignorance and the insularity of what that side of the field can be. And that was a long time ago, and that particular company has changed many times since then. But at the time, it did feel kind of like, okay, I see. You want this to be in a specific box, and there is no fact that's ever going to change your mind about what box this thing has to be in, which is really small, kids comic, weird alternative press thing. And a Scholastic book fair check in my pocket that would have blown his mind wouldn't have changed his mind either, you know? And it did the same thing with Archie, though, with something like Sonic, right? Which, I mean, you would all regularly hear, like, X-Men was the juggernaut throughout the 90s, but Sonic was selling close to those numbers, if not, right? They're not exactly those numbers.
Yeah, Sonic was doing really well, and I remember when we were looking into, like, the newsstand, which became less and less a part of distribution, but was still out there. It was kind of like you still could find it in a drugstore or a spinner rack that someone hadn't pulled out of the stores that had been there for years. That when I was doing the numbers, I was like, Sonic was before I was with Archie, Sonic was selling better than Spider-Man, just on the general newsstand, if you know, and better than, these other major brands, and yet it was considered this kind of off on the side kids book that you just wouldn't think of it as something that was a major player, but it was a player in its own right under different rules, just like Amelia was, and that really it is heartening now to look at that, and you see how many different ways people are getting comics, and people kind of accept it. That oh yeah, well I picked this up at Costco, or I found this over in my library. And that's stuff that didn't happen in the past, and so many people pioneered in so many different ways to prove that there's an audience in all these different places. And yeah, definitely Amelia was part of it. That was amazing when Ed gave you that chance with Amelia as a graphic novel. There hadn't been a whole lot of them yet, even at that point in the fairs, and to see that they could take just a huge amount of copies and they found their audience, you know, because they had this amazing network of school book fairs and clubs.
Well, you know, yeah. Right before that, you know, there was this sort of limbo where we were putting Amelia out. It was doing what it was doing, and it was right before I had hired Harald, and we didn't have trade paperbacks in print because the previous publisher of the trade paperbacks that passed away. It was a whole thing. And John and I started going to library shows. And you had mentioned libraries. And I remember the first, I'm not sure which if it was in New Orleans.
My first was in New Orleans. I think you may have done one show before that.
Oh yeah, Chicago, that's correct. But New Orleans was the first one where it was like the graphic novel pavilion.
Right.
And it was like, oh my gosh, people are hungry for this. They want it. You know, and we were used to going to comic book conventions, and you know, if you weren't working on Supergirl, you were supposed to be a fan with a painting of Supergirl, like in her underpants. Like those were the two things you could do, and we didn't want to do either of those things, so we would just be used to being ignored.
Well, he was doing Supergirl in a turtleneck.
What?
A turtleneck.
So, Joe, we started going to these library shows, and it was like a light switch, you know.
Right. It was amazing too, because we were approached by Diamond Books, which was the largest distributor of comics across the world, but now they were realizing we need to look at the book market. We need to look at libraries and bookstores and spread this out. And they were having a conversation saying, essentially, if only there was a group of people that were pushing books that were appropriate for these audiences. And they came in that day and looked across the aisle from them, and there we were with this big banner that said "Kids Love Comics," and it was very exciting. It was funny though, because I still tell the story of all these librarians. That was the year that librarians went. It went from me having to explain what a graphic novel or a comic book for kids was, to being hugged by a librarian at a Christmas party that year. And the librarians were just so great and supportive. But one guy came up and he was like, and Jimmy's sick of me telling this story, but he's like, graphic novels, huh? And it's like, yeah, you probably get a lot of people stealing those out of the libraries. And this was like the last generation of older librarians who were looking down, and Jimmy goes, "Oh yeah, like the the street toughs that come into the library and they're looking for stuff to steal." And that was like, I could not believe how
I know how those kids are. I know.
It was so disrespectful and awesome at the same time. And he's like, "Well, they should be reading the classics." And this was like the 1-2 punch, because Jimmy's like, "Well, what's the classics to you?" And he's like, "Dickens." And Jimmy, I think you said, "Well, Dickens was serialized in penny newspapers." And I didn't know that, but I was impressed, and now I use it all the time. It makes me look really smart.
Yeah, I don't think it was penny newspapers, but yes, he was serialized, and it was a popular writer, and yeah,
the back of Post.
Yeah.
Been canonized, so I will allow them within my world. Well, that requires zero bravery. Like Shakespeare, He was okay. I mean, But to be these librarians who did go and say, "This is a new format. I don't completely understand it, but I know these kids love it." And at the beginning, like the cutting edge, it was, well, at least they're reading something.
Right.
And then it didn't take too long for that to turn into, oh, they're reading things that are really good. Because, someone on a panel not too long ago asked me, like, well, you've done all these kids' books. Do you ever want to do something serious? And I'm like, what? Like Green Lantern? Is that serious? Like, I'm serious as a heart attack, dude. I mean, this is what I'm doing. And, Harriet the Spy was serious. Huckleberry Finn is serious. And they were written for kids initially. But that's art. And I was never under the impression that just because it was for kids, it couldn't be great.
Right. I think the librarians really helped that a lot, because they were the initial ones to support kids' graphic novels in any significant way. And so what they rewarded by purchasing was what was continued. And so the level of kids' comics, because of the curation of those librarians, I think went up very, very fast. And I think a lot of people were, the nature of those books changed because the initial support was coming from people who were very discerning in terms of what they were looking for in a book. And kids' graphic novels are just, the quality of kids' comics, I think, is remarkable. And we can thank, in part, the librarians for that.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Next time on the Comic Book Diner, Jimmy Gownley talks about the dumbest idea ever, coming soon from Scholastic Books.
The Comic Book Diner is brought to you by Smith Micro, makers of Manga Studio, Motion Artist, and Poser software. What will you create? Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or you can always catch them on the web at www.my.smithmicro.com.